Welcome back to Sterling Insights. Today, we have a special guest host, our own chief podcast producer, Don Michelle Lewis. Don Michelle will be taking the reins today to interview Katherine and me together. Welcome to Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, the go-to podcast for financial advisors aiming to grow their assets under management, stand out in a crowded market, and retain assets nearly forever. Are you advising high net worth clients who own appreciated capital assets? Do you want to help them sell without losing a quarter, a third, or even more of their hard-earned profits to capital gains taxes? Then this podcast is tailored for you. Each episode brings you the latest strategies and expert advice from leading financial advisors, seasoned attorneys, and experienced CPAs. Learn how to maximize your clients' wealth, minimize their taxes, and supercharge your advisory practice with actionable insights. Join us on Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, where you'll gain the knowledge and tools to set yourself apart and achieve unparalleled success in wealth management. Subscribe now and empower your practice for a brighter, more prosperous future. Welcome back to Sterling Insights. Today, we have a special guest host, our own chief podcast producer, Don Michelle Lewis. Don will be taking the reins to interview Katherine and me. Don?
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be interviewing you today. So I actually want to start with a question for both of you. How does the family dynamic play into the way you work together? Like, have you learned anything about yourselves or each other while you've been collaborating professionally?
Katherine and I have been working together kind of forever. Through high school, Katherine was homeschooled, and I worked very closely with her on that. So it's far from the first time that we've worked together. And even when Katherine was a teenager, she was basically having sole responsibility for running a program that I had put together, but that I then turned over to her. And it was tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a homeschool program. And Katherine was actually running it pretty much by herself when she was a teenager. So that part of the transition has actually been very smooth. And now we can get Katherine's view on that.
I think I was probably a freshman in high school, so probably about 14. We were flying for vacation over the holidays, and my dad and I were sitting, and I was getting some help from him on my physics homework. And, we worked probably for like a couple hours on this. It was, transcontinental flight. So the flight was quite long, and we worked for a while. And at one point, we were chatting with the woman next to us, and she sort of asked, like, who are you? What do you guys do? And at one point she remarked, oh, I thought you must be homeschooled because you and your dad work so well together. And so that was kind of a fun little peek into how someone else might see our collaboration.
Oh, I love that so much. Now, Roger, you've made quite a name for yourself by blending the worlds of finance and philanthropy. So how has your approach changed over the years, and what keeps you so passionate about bringing these two areas together?
Maybe the thing that has evolved the most for me, Don Michelle, so as you pointed out, we got our start my partner Jim and I started Sterling in 1998. And the company, as you know, is called Sterling Foundation Management. And that foundation refers to private foundations, which, as you know, are type of charitable organization primarily used by high net worth individuals and families. Maybe the thing that's developed the most is that I have come to more fully appreciate that in the high net worth world, philanthropy is probably the primary motivator for 20% of the people. And the other 80%, it probably requires a different approach. I mean, most people are philanthropic, but most people, 80% or so, it's not the top. And so I think what's changed over the years is we as an organization have come to understand better how to meet the needs of that 80% where philanthropy might not be their primary motivation.
Well, and you just touched on, getting private foundations, and you have books that dive really deep into that. So if someone's thinking about starting one, what's the smartest step they can take, and what common hurdles should they watch out for?
Is it too self-serving to suggest that they get the book and read it?
No, this is the best time to mention it.
So the book is the more recent one is the title is Managing Foundations and Charitable Trusts. And it's published by Wiley. You can get it on Amazon. You can find it on our website. And really that's written for both the high net worth person and also their financial advisors. In that book, we cover a very large range, a very wide range of topics and kind of give people a background. So a lot of our clients actually come to us having read the book because they don't start at complete zero. They can ask better questions, be more informed, they can make better decisions, they can make more effective choices to accomplish what they want.
You mentioned you have another book, which, Katherine, I believe you teamed up with your dad to write The Investor's Dilemma Decoded. I have to ask, what was that experience like? And how did each of you bring something unique to that?
That was a really good experience. I've always enjoyed writing, and working with my dad in an area that he knows so much about was really interesting. I studied economics in college as an undergrad, and I was interested in finance, but there weren't a whole lot of finance classes. So getting to work on the book with my dad helped me bring in some of the stuff I was learning in economics, some of the stuff that I was kind of hearing about from classes, but not really getting to dive into, and then learn a lot from my dad, as well as collaborate on writing the actual book. I think it was the first time that I'd really gotten to write something that would be published to a wide audience. Obviously I'd written a lot for high school and college, but your professor sees it and your TA sees it, and maybe 3 people ever read what you spent so much time writing. So it was really cool to get to work on something where I knew that it would be actually seen by a wider audience, and that was really motivating. Last year, at about this time, on the 24th, our publisher emailed me and was like, I need you to read the entire manuscript again and make edits and give me these edits by the 26th of December. And I was like, well, Christmas is a holiday, but I was pretty motivated to get this thing done. So I spent a lot of Christmas just reading through the manuscript and making sure that it was edited to the best of its ability and that we could get it out to the publisher in time. That experience of getting to work on something that would actually be read kind of showed me the excitement of when people read your work. That was one of the things that inspired me to actually start a Substack blog, that's been one of my recent projects. So this blog kind of it's really focused on people in their 20s and 30s making transitions in life. And so I talk a lot about career choices and career productivity and things that people can keep in mind. Basically things that I learned, and I'm trying to give people a shortcut to learning.
That is really interesting. I'm glad I got to learn Substack, and now I'll have to go look at it myself.
So it's called Trailblazing 20s. Trailblazing20s.substack.com in case anyone wants to Google it.
Amazing. Now, how do you feel that this book has built on, the other, how does it connect with the ones that you've already had published? Roger, that might be a question more for you.
Yeah. So the Investor's Dilemma Decoded is really focused, as the title suggests, on the investment aspect only. So in the Managing Foundations and Charitable Trust book, we have a section in there on investment policies, right? Every organization, like a private foundation or an endowment, anybody that's kind of investing for more than just themselves. I mean, it's a good idea even for your own account to have what they call an investment policy statement. But that's like a very high level overview of what are we trying to achieve? What are the parameters? What's our time frame? Most endowments, for example, kind of have an indefinite to infinite time frame, as opposed to like a lot of retirement plans are designed to take care of somebody from the time that the person retires through the end of life. And then there's lots of different purposes for investing. So those are the kind of things we talk about in the managing foundations and charitable trusts. In the Investor's Dilemma Decoded, we're much more focused on the what to do and how to do it of investing, not the picking stocks. We don't talk about that at all, but it's at that level between the person who's actually managing the money and the very high level of abstraction. So, for example, we deal in there with some things that don't get a lot of attention or don't get proper attention. One example that comes to mind is TIPS, these Treasury inflation protected securities, I think is what TIPS stand for. They're supposedly these inflation proof bonds. And so we have a whole section in the Investor's Dilemma Decoded explaining what they really are. And it turns out that they are very complicated securities, very complicated, so complicated that if they weren't issued by the government, I'm willing to bet that they'd be restricted to what they call accredited investors, high net worth people, because they are a package of hard to value securities and options. In fact, we actually wrote a different book. I wrote a different book in 21 called Politicians Spend, We Pay, because back in 2020 and 2021, when the government decided to print the gazillion dollars, I thought this has to lead to inflation, but I want to start from the beginning and make sure that my thinking is right. Anyway, I ended up writing a book about it. And one of the things in there that I predicted was that TIPS would be a disaster. And it turns out that they actually were. You would have thought that in those couple years of very high inflation, 22, 23, TIPS would have done well. In fact, they did terribly. And that was predictable based on actually understanding what they are instead of just looking at the headline. So that's the kind of thing that I was trying to do in the Investor's Dilemma Decoded, is to help people learn how to think, not what to think, but how to think about these various investments. Because, there's infinite amount of information out there, most of which is just noise, and a great deal of which is either irrelevant or wrong. But it's not rocket science if you strip away all that noise. And that's what we're trying to do in the Investor's Dilemma Decoded.
Well, see, now I have another book I need to read. Now, Katherine, you had touched on your Substack, and the next generation is shaking things up in every industry, including wealth management. So how do you see younger voices changing the game and rethinking traditional approaches?
Yeah. I mean, I think like you kind of hinted at, a lot of people or a lot of younger people are wanting to throw off tradition, or at least kind of veer away from it and do more of their own independent thing. They also seem to want shortcuts to things. I think smartphones just exacerbate that. But people are often pretty impatient and just want to know how to do something and want to know how to do something kind of independently. And I think that's another reason that I was motivated to start my blog, is that I wanted to help people understand some of the things that I came to understand, but things that took me, a good year or two, or sometimes even 3 to understand about corporate life or about career things that were working or not working. So what I hope to do with that blog is really help people come to some of these realizations faster and be able to try out new things in the workplace faster than I was able to do.
Well, and you specifically are working in a space that can sometimes feel like a boys' club. So, what challenges have you faced, and what would you say to other young women who are looking to make their mark in your industry?
Yeah. I think a big challenge was maybe not so much the specific industry, but the fact that at least the companies that I've worked, corporate life is just very different than what I was used to in college. So the big transition wasn't going into consulting or finance or whatever per se. It was more like coming out of college and getting into a corporate or a small business environment where expectations and ways of working are just so different. So, for example, one big thing that stood out to me or that I eventually learned was that I shouldn't just blindly follow my manager's orders. I was coming from like a college perspective where like you did what your professor said and that's how you were rewarded. And if you veered right or left and tried to get too creative, you were just going to get a lower grade because it didn't meet the instructions or didn't meet your professor's idealized version of what you were supposed to give them. So when I got to the corporate world, I kind of somehow thought that that's how things should work, that I should just do exactly what my managers said. But that did not always turn out very well because sometimes the instructions were really vague or sometimes they just didn't make sense. And so it took me a while, but I finally realized that I should be asking questions and really thinking deeply about what my managers asked, trying to see the end goal and understand where they were coming from instead of just doing whatever they said. So I recently wrote a post on that called Don't Just Blindly Follow Your Manager's Orders, where I kind of talk about why you shouldn't just do whatever they say and what you might want to do instead. I think that was a big change from college life to corporate life.
That is certainly worth noting. Transitions can be hard. So, you've been on the road sharing insights with financial pros everywhere. What's the single biggest lesson you hope to take away from your seminars?
I think the biggest takeaway that the financial professionals will get from our seminars and our speaking is the understanding that there's this wide and deep toolbox of tools that are labeled, they come with the label charitable or philanthropic, and that because of that labeling, that turns off a lot of people who can and should benefit from the use of those tools. So, for example, I think I mentioned earlier that something like 80%, almost all high net worth people, I mean, this applies to all people, but to high net worth people in particular, have some charitable interest. But for maybe 80% of them, it's not a top motivating interest. And what we would like the financial professionals to kind of learn to incorporate better is the idea that even if somebody doesn't think that he or she is really all that interested in charity, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be looking at some of these tools because they might be able to accomplish some of their goals and accomplish philanthropy at the same time.
Looking ahead, what trends are you seeing on the horizon that will shape the way people plan their giving and handle their money?
Um, Developing trends is the use of donor advised funds. So very briefly, a donor advised fund is they've actually been around for almost 100 years. They became popular 30 or 40 years ago, and they've really grown in the last, say, 10 or 20 years. So a donor advised fund is a public charity that can make a contribution to the donor advised fund. The donor gets a charitable deduction at that time, then the donor advised fund can invest the money, and the person who put the money in, that's called the donor advisor, and can give advice basically to the fund. And so I want to give money to this charitable organization or that charitable organization. And that has really opened up a new frontier of charitable contributions, because a lot of people who maybe in the past would have either thought, oh, I have to do a private foundation, which they didn't really want to incur the overhead or the cost or the hassle. And they weren't yet ready to give the money completely away to their end user charities. So that group of people now has a very low overhead way of effectively getting most of the benefits of a private foundation. And we're really talking for contributions for, in the old days when we started in a business, you could do a foundation for $1 million. You still can, but we recommend to people that if you're in that $1 million range or 2 million or 3 million, really look seriously at a donor advised fund instead of a private foundation. Now, obviously we'll do the foundation if people want it. We also have a donor advised fund, so we can do that. It's really just another tool that's really changed the face of philanthropy in terms of broadening the appeal to a wider group of people who otherwise might not have been as generous with their money.
And then what is next for the two of you? Do you have any new projects, books, big ideas that your listeners should keep on their radar?
Yes, we have multiple. One that I'll talk about is we are working on a book about trusts. It's an area that doesn't necessarily excite people most of the time. And there are actually a lot of really interesting things. So, for example, one of the chapters in that book that you wouldn't think of is Ted Williams. Ted Williams was the greatest baseball hitter maybe ever. Anyway, he died early part of this century. And I'm afraid that for some people, maybe of your generation, he's most well known, if he's known at all, because they decapitated him and froze his head in his body.
What?
It turns out, though, that you can have if you choose to do this, and not very many people have been frozen after they died because they said that's what I want to have done. But Ted Williams is by far the most famous one. You can have a trust, because let's say you're going to freeze yourself. Let's say that's your plan. The idea is, this might not be obvious to everybody, somebody gets frozen, and sometime in the future, very distant future, the hope is that technology will exist or will be developed to essentially bring people back from the dead if their bodies were preserved intact. There's lots of science fiction stories about this.
Yeah, Door in the Summer.
That's
If
the
anyone
one.
wants.
Yeah.
By Robert Heinlein, if anyone wants a book recommendation.
So anyway, the idea is, I used to have a client who wanted me to look into this. This was a long time ago. And in case anyone's wondering, he did die. And as far as I know, he did not get himself frozen. But it introduced me to this rather ultra subject. It's basically eccentric millionaires who get themselves frozen. And so they might be thinking, well, if 200 years from now I get revived, am I going to all of a sudden be penniless? And so there's a chapter in the book about if that's you, read the book or when it's out, because there's a chapter in there about how you can have a trust that may take care of you when and if you get brought back to life. So, And then, of course, much more common, again, still that a lot of people would worry about, and most people wouldn't worry about being frozen, but a lot of people would worry about if you're kind of single and old and don't have close people and you have a pet or pets, you can have a trust to take care of your pets. And of course, those are much more popular than getting the other kind of trust to call it cryo trust. Cryo is like cryogenesis is like the science of freezing tissues or something like that. And then all the standard stuff, all the different kinds of trusts that people hear about. And a lot of people, they don't need to know it until they need to know it. And so we're putting together what we hope to be a single resource. And now it's not going to be particularly from a legal perspective because there are lots of those. This is from a use perspective and an economic perspective of how do we think about making this actually work, not legally, but practically. And so then, because you can't do everything, and there are lots of good people, and we would always recommend if you're going to have a trust, get it put together by a professional. We want to teach people how to think intelligently about these topics that most people, if they have to deal with it, they deal with it once in their life. And so they can't be an expert. And so we try to provide some of that expertise. So at least they can have a grounding and ask the right questions. That's the goal of this book.
I find that absolutely fascinating. And now that I know that I can get a trust for my pets, that's going to be on my list of things to do. Katherine, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Not particularly. I'm continuing to write a blog and scale that. And I think for a lot of the financial advisors that we work with who may have kids similar age to me or slightly younger, that could hopefully be a resource that they can check out.
For those who are just beginning their journey into finance or philanthropy, what's your best piece of advice for them to get started on the right foot?
Well, if it's philanthropy, I would again recommend the book that we wrote because we wrote it for that purpose. It's called Managing Foundations and Charitable Trusts. And if they are interested in investing, which I'm not sure so finance is an incredibly broad field, but if we're talking about investing, I would say The Investor's Dilemma Decoded is not for the absolute beginner, but it does start at the absolute beginning. If you have absolutely no knowledge, I'd have to think about that. But pretty much nobody who we ever deal with is starting from zero. They're all starting from kind of a common base. We've all heard of the stock market and bonds, and everybody knows about real estate. So, if you took a Martian, I don't know where I'd start them, but I don't deal with very many Martians.
And on that note, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me and do this interview for your show. And obviously, we'll put in the show notes how people can contact you. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Don Michelle.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, where we provide the info you need from successful leading financial advisors, lawyers, and CPAs. Your hosts, Roger and Katherine Silk, invite you to learn more about Sterling Foundation Management by visiting sterlingfoundations.com.